Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live stream. Today, we'll be talking about shifting power from defining outputs to discovering outcomes. With me today, I have Paul Gaffney. Paul Gaffney is a change agent. He led really incredible transformations in technology, operations, and overall business results for a lot of iconic American brands like Home Depot, Dick's Sporting Goods, Kohl's, Staples, Office Depot, and Charles Schwab, a whole lot of them. Paul's held roles including Chief Technology Officer, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Supply Chain Officer, and Chief Executive Officer. And one thing I really love about Paul is that he takes a human-centered approach. It just oozes from him anytime you talk to him, to identifying and solving problems. And that makes him exceptional at motivating team members to contribute to success in ways they might not have thought possible. So, and a couple other notes, Paul's also been an early stage executive at two startups, the initial CEO of Website Pros, now Web.com, and the COO of Desktone, acquired by VMware. Paul was also inducted into the CIO Hall of Fame by CIO Magazine. So, Paul, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Brian, that's a really kind introduction. Some of those things I'd forgotten about, so thanks.
Thanks. So I think as a conference organizer, I'm not supposed to pick favorites, and I got called out for this, but the cat's out of the bag. I told everyone that your talk from Prodacity was my favorite. So if you haven't, if you're watching, please go to the Prodacity website and check out Paul's talk. But the reason it's my favorite, Paul, is because across all of government, I'm seeing that the main barrier to scaling, and even starting sometimes, is what you talked about in your overview of the movement from projects to products. It really doesn't get enough attention. And when it does, it's usually the wrong kind: complaining, admiring the problem, misunderstanding. So it's also become a bit of a buzz phrase, though, project to product. So can you give everyone a quick overview of what you mean when you say it?
Yeah. And thank you for, admitting that as a new conference organizer, you actually made a mistake. But, we'll get to that later. That's, it's important to actually do that and then learn from it. I don't think you're wrong, but I'm kind of biased. But you sort of set a high bar. I hope you invite me back to a live Prodacity, and I'll try and raise the bar so that you think Paul 2 is better than Paul 1. And I did talk a lot in that talk about projects to product. And I'm going to try and summarize what I think is the most important shift, the most important kind of definition of the two. Project is easy, I think, because everybody knows it. But because everybody knows it, it means a little bit different to everyone. But what I mean by a project organization is an organization that, with some regularity, and this is usually annual, conducts an exercise to figure out who's going to get some money to spend and what are they going to get to spend it on. And the competition for winning those projects is usually this months-long, what I call the project pageant, where individual teams, they get together, they put their float together, and there's this parade that goes in front of the executives, and they pick the winning floats, and those get the money. A lot of one thing that you could admire about the project approach is things are pretty clearly defined. I think that's about the only thing you could admire about it, because there's nothing in that. The floats are not alike. There's nothing that requires that the parade actually have any coherence. There's generally nothing in the mechanism that figures out how do these projects stitch together. How do they actually line up with the strategy of the company, though to a certain extent the project review process is supposed to do that. Usually what happens is some poor, folks stuck in the architecture organization have to then try to corral all of the execution of these projects to attempt to make them be somewhat coherent. But that's kind of impossible. And years of this rinse and repeat on the project cycle leads to a whole collection of disconnected and, in often cases, highly fragmented implementations of the same thing. But, there were a lot of project launch parties and a lot of project success parties along the way. Product is actually harder, but much better for the people involved and much better for the firm. Product is a step back and saying, wait a minute, what does this business, what does this enterprise fundamentally do? What is the list of N, and not an incredibly large N, but not a trivially small N either, and somewhere around 40 or 50 or 60. What are the 40 or 50, 60 fundamental things that this enterprise does? And identifying a team or teams that will be durably devoted to each of those things to build a coherent, reliable, high performance, flexible software implementation of that fundamental aspect of the enterprise. In retail, and everyone on this call has shopped at retail, so they can kind of grok this. You can start naming the product list just by the things that you experience as a customer. There's a pricing product, right? Give this thing a product identifier and some kind of context, and have it come back with what should I charge the customer for that. An inventory service, something that keeps track of inventory. And pretty much in every business context, you don't have to be deeply experienced to come up with a good portion of the product map. What this does is this prevents this kind of fragmentation. It prevents the cumulative cruft that flows out of the project pageant. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. And, when you talk about the budget, which we'll talk some about today, when we're dealing in the GovCon space, that budgeting process it's not annual. It's often, projected 5 years out.
Yeah.
And it's very locked in, even 5 years out. And really, that's a misnomer because the planning starts 2 years before that 5 years. So you had actually the speaker right before you at Prodacity went in depth on the budgeting cycle. And you said that's horrifying and far worse than I ever imagined. So we'll get to that. But, a lot I want to talk to you about today. We could probably go on for hours, we have in the past. But for today, I wanted to focus on 3 themes. Getting the wrong people off the bus in this project to product move. Planning by fiat that often happens. And then the budgeting pageant, as you referred to it as. And I hope we can kind of weave in some of the current events at Southwest Airlines. But you often talk about
and a disastrous outage of the NOTAM system this morning. So another you've got to be kidding me.
For sure. So you often talk about getting the wrong people off the bus. You phrase it differently than I do, but essentially how important of a step that is in large enterprises when you're making the shift from project to product. So can you talk a little bit about that and some of the lessons you've learned along the way?
Yeah. And I want to provide also just a little bit of historical context, because there are probably a lot of people saying, well, who the heck's this Gaffney guy, right? He's been with a couple of these big brands. I think I'm believable, but I'm going to kind of give a few footnotes. For anyone who really wants to make the project to product case, the pièce de résistance of that is Amazon, right? That is, they had a kind of come to Bezos moment, right? That's like a come to Jesus moment, but come to Bezos moment in the early 2000s, where they realized they didn't call it, we're going to move to product. I wish they had. It'd make a lot of people's current jobs easier. But when you study what they did, when they basically said, we're constraining our own growth because people keep having to get together in meetings to talk about coordinating their stuff. And they essentially, I'm oversimplifying here because this was a lot of work, but they essentially said, teams can only talk to each other through software. From this date forward, they can only talk to each other through software. They can't talk to somebody else's database. We've got to retire a whole raft of Perl scripts that are doing all the analytics for the business. And in that moment, they essentially said, we are going to commit to a software expression of Amazon, and we're going to commit to using that software expression as the internal mechanism. That was actually an internal mechanism of coordination. That was actually a getting people off the bus exercise. That was actually exercise in saying, no, you don't get to roll your own and mass up a bunch of resources and then go do your own thing. You have to use this thing. And if you're going to process a payment, you go through this payment API. And if you're going to look up a product, you go through this product lookup API. And if it doesn't work for you, there are mechanisms for figuring out how to get a request into the team that owns that to make it better. And they've now been doing this for over 20 years. And it's one of the meaningful competitive advantages that allows them to, when they want to, field any team they want and have it not distract the rest of the enterprise. And what so that's the reference on kind of why product is really important, and the most durable example that I know of.
And really quick for the audience too, that might be more interested in looking into that. He's referring to the Bezos mandate, and there's an excellent write-up, or at least my favorite write-up of it comes from Steve Yeagee's platform rant. So if you Google that, you'll find Steve Yeagee's platform rant as he moved from Amazon to Google.
Now, what happens? Most companies aren't there, and I've taken several companies on this journey. I think the Home Depot is a long way down the path, but I don't know anyone who's actually like completely there. Netflix even went on this journey. I think they're probably there. It's a less relevant domain to most everyone else. I know, though, on the other hand, there are a lot of organizations that are nowhere near there. And one of the ways you can tell is how big their engineering headcount is. I don't know if this is true. I haven't fact checked this. I stumbled across this over the last month, that there are like 69,000 software engineers in the Citibank organization. Wow. 69,000. And I can only surmise that that comes from a phenomenon that actually American Airlines talked about in public. They have been going through a project-to-product transformation over the past 4 years, and they talked about experiencing the last several revs of the project cycle where everything was dramatically more expensive and everything required dramatically more people. And when you see these immensely large organizations, but you can look at the business as an investor or as a consumer and saying, this company is not making progress at that rate. They're not getting better at the rate of 69,000 person years of engineering every year. And so you know that it's being suboptimized by dealing with the leftovers of all of the unresolved conflicts in the project model. And one of the critical steps is figuring out, as you move from projects to products, you're going to have all these people who still want to be involved. And they want to be involved in stuff that they actually can't add value to. They can criticize, they can naysay, they can insist that product X must have A, B, and C in it because A, B, and C is very important to them, may not actually be needed inside of the product. And one of the most important steps, and I actually realized this very early in my career, though I didn't know it at the time, one of the important steps to doing anything meaningful is to identify the meaningful thing and then identify the small team, which rarely actually needs a bus, right? It needs like a couple Jeeps. Identify the 2 Jeep team that is competent and is trusted, and then keep everybody away from them. Run interference while you give that team the freedom to go really address the problem at hand. I suspect, Brian, you mentioned current events. I suspect and I hope that someone at Southwest is going to let that happen and figure out. I'm certain. I mean, Southwest is a quality organization. I'm certain there are people in there, 8 or 10 of them, who probably for years have known exactly how they might approach this really meaningful business problem of scheduling their people and keeping the schedule of their people in sync with the physical reality of their assets, right? Southwest essentially is in the business of matching people and metal. Right. And thankfully, unlike the Air Force, usually at predictable locations. The Air Force has some unpredictable locations. And they've struggled with this from time to time because of the nature of their current approach to both their business and the problem. The interesting and perverse thing, though, and again, the footnote on this one, Fred Brooks wrote about this in the early 1970s, right? This is the Mythical Man Month. This is the essence of the Mythical Man Month. So this is the inverse of Brooks' Law, right? Brooks' Law is the more resources you add to a project, the later it gets.
Yes.
The inverse is to get things done, have small teams, take resources away. And taking resources away has the wonderful effect of removing distractions, allowing people to get into flow, having people feel like they really have agency on solving the problem, not feeling like they're going to have to explain their decision making to 65 or 100 people, all of whom want to find a way to criticize their decision making before they actually get anything done.
Yeah, I think I don't know that you and I have ever talked about this, but I'm curious when you talk specifically about transformation. Everybody, of course, brings up the frozen middle. I have always asserted that that's actually the middle of the diffusion of innovation or idea adoption curve, the early and late majority. So it could exist anywhere in the organization. It's not the middle layer of the organization. It's kind of where they sit from a mindset perspective. But people will often ask, what do we do about those people? Or, how do you interact with them? And I often say, just don't. Until you can meet their expectations or address their concerns, you really don't. Do you agree? Should you not only like get them off the bus or the team or the Jeeps, but what kind of interaction should you be having with them, if any, throughout this change process?
It's an interesting question. I'm a total free agent at this point, so I can give an unfettered answer. I'll tether it to some situations that I've been in my career. I think there are two reasonable ways to handle this. One of these ways is going to sound unreasonable, but it's actually the way that I prefer. If you can manufacture the circumstances where you actually, in a humane and values consistent way, allow some of those people to go work for another company, that's almost always the right answer. There's in my experience, and I, at another time we could go through the evidence that I have for this. But in my experience, most enterprises, particularly their headquarters operations, not all, I have seen this done well, but most are, they have too much headcount. And I've not explored the driver of all of these things, but all of those people want something to do. And one of the real challenges is, especially if you are years deep into the project pageant, you can't actually do that much, right? Every year you've reduced your degrees of freedom a little bit every year. But in general, the people are still around. And so there are more floats in the pageant, but there are fewer winners. But the people who put the things into the pageant, even if they didn't get a project approved, they still have their day job and they still have demands, and that often results in they call their friends and try to get their friends to do work for them on the side. And to me, though, that's all an indication of there are too many headquarters resources for what the company is capable of handling. And I've had the good fortune in two circumstances. One, when we were doing a pretty aggressive financial turnaround at AAA. And the answer was, we needed to go from a pretty significant annual loss to at least a reasonable amount of profit. And that just involved being, again, very humane about displaced folks, but kind of cleaning up. It's very difficult to move forward if you have too many people who most people want to be involved in things. And so if you have more want to be involved than can be involved, it's a problem. It was a gift at the beginning of the pandemic. We had and we talked about this publicly at Kohl's. We had a very large project organization when I first joined Kohl's. And I had the opportunity to cut that dramatically right at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was a substantial boost to the efficiency, not only financial, but also just productivity of the organization. Now, this path is challenging. If you've never done it before, you might think I'm just making it up, but those two stories are actually quite true. And the other path is to do I think, much more challenging thing of figuring out how to allow a lot of people to have a sense of involvement while protecting small teams. And that's much more challenging. The process of having those small teams have regular mechanisms like you and I have talked about, growth boards, and other machinery that is designed to facilitate broader involvement with the minimal amount of distraction. That's the second path.
Yeah, I think both of those probably definitely resonate with the government audience. I think what is interesting at the government is there's a lot of humane options for, the company is so large when you put together, especially the entire DoD, and then if you add federal into the mix, it's the Fortune #1. So I think the ability to find new roles within the company, if we call it that, is pretty great. And there's actually a need, right?
Yeah. This is probably gonna surprise some people who know me well, and may even be a tad controversial. But I think, unlike most enterprises, the government as a whole is probably understaffed. The distribution is probably not evenly understaffed, but there are critical functions in terms of just providing citizen value, where that the constraint on better service is just there are no resources.
Right. Yes, I agree. It's a distribution problem. I want to, for that second option that you mentioned, I think what a lot of people do and why it's so immensely popular is they move to frameworks like SAFe. I know you have strong opinions about SAFe, but I would like the audience to hear.
I think that many of these frameworks, look, first of all, I want to give a lot of credit to the people who are selling them. One of the most important things in building a business is to figure out what your market will buy and to sell it to them. And if I'm right that there are a lot of these organizations where you need to keep a lot of people busy, but they're not really adding material value to the outcome, well, then you buy something like SAFe, which creates a whole bunch of roles for people who aren't adding any value. The structures, the names of the roles, the things that people do. I posted on LinkedIn last week. It's just all extraordinarily unnecessarily complicated. There's what we are all striving to do is quite straightforward. We're trying to understand where is there an opportunity to enhance the value of the firm by either growing revenue or doing the same amount of revenue at a lower cost, or doing both simultaneously and growing profits. And to do that, the recipe is actually quite simple. If you have competent people who can understand economics, who can understand building software, and who can understand designing a system that people will love using, and those three things in that order are product management, engineering, and design. If you have competent people who can do those things, and you give them an economic goal, and you give them a problem area that they can own, and then you give them the freedom to go hit that economic goal in whichever way they discover, largely by spending almost all of their time in direct interaction with the people who actually use the software. That's it. There's nothing more that you need. And if you and I were to pull up a bunch of like Scrum charts or SAFe charts, I don't want to just pick on those two. Any of these frameworks, that kernel, the valuable kernel that I just walked through with you, that I walked through on a LinkedIn post a week or so ago, that kernel is some small fraction of this massive, complicated map.
Yes, I agree. I think what you
now
just
keeps
said
a lot
there,
of people. It keeps a lot of people busy.
It does, and I think the desirability of it is twofold. I think, one, to your point, people looking for something to do, and I think there's also people that are looking to find things for those people to do and hope that they can keep them at bay and work their products. But I never really see it work out that way, and it's so heavyweight to implement up front. But I do want to pivot because, and it's actually a good segue, what you just described about what you would do, and giving people basically that autonomy runs at odds with what we typically see, which is planning by fiat. In fact, most SAFe implementations are by fiat. So Tell people what you mean by that and some of the cautionary tales there.
Yeah, I don't think at Prodacity I really spent much time sharing with folks my two paradigmatic characters that I've observed. If people go and take a look at the talk I did for Gene Kim's conference out in Vegas, I talk about two characters, Chris and Dana. I'm not going to do the whole Chris and Dana story. The most relevant piece, though, is that there is this behavior. I label it the Dana behavior, that is based on a real belief. I don't think this is Machiavellian. I don't think this is in any way strange. A real belief that Dana knows exactly what everyone else should do.
Yes.
And in particular, if Dana has been successful through several or many cycles of the project pageant, Dana has honed their skills at not only deciding what should be done, but then holding people accountable to doing that thing. And it's certainly not I don't think all project organizations do this, but I think they all have some similar feeling. I have found myself at the beginning of a transformation from project to product several times, and pretty pervasively across all of them at the beginning, in the first several months when I'm still trying to figure out what's going on in this org. I would almost always see a bunch of things, and I'd look at it and say, boy, any objective person looking at this would say, you all should have addressed this thing over here. And everyone, I've learned to be a little disarming. People will say, oh yeah, we all know we should have addressed that. And then the answer to, well, okay, we all know, new person can see it, it's really in the way. The answer will almost always be some flavor of, but we weren't funded for that. Yep. Which means that there's some level of policing that the orders to implement XYZ were also constraints. And it's, and some people I know, maybe not everyone has experienced multiple versions of this, and sometimes it's hard to use a software reference. When I explain this to executives, I explain why, if we were running a hotel and we went in and we found out like that every single one of the bathrooms had a sewage backup problem and that someone should have fixed it, no one would find it acceptable to say, yeah, but that wasn't budgeted. And yet with systems, there are often these cases where, yeah, we were only budgeted to work on, improving the shower. The toilet's broken, but that didn't make the cut. And it's the same skills in the room.
Right.
So the double-edged sword of the fiat is, a lot of people then they basically disengage, and there's a lot of commentary. You can find this on Reddit. You can find this pretty much anywhere. There's just this deep sense of disengagement among folks who live in the world where they're told what to do, even if that world has moved to a trying to do product. Mm-hmm. There's this product management terrible, capitulation on Reddit where someone is saying, I tried to do all the Marty Kagan things, and then I realized I should just cave. And I should just, whatever anybody wants me to put on the backlog, and I just become the backlog jockey. And this person said, and my life's a lot easier. There can't be a lot of job satisfaction in that, though. So the method of small handful of people decide and everyone else does, I think that's applicable to a lot of things that never happen in business.
Right.
We simply have to motivate a whole bunch of force at this place at this time, and we don't want any input after we've decided to do that. But those circumstances, those like someone has decided and everyone else executes, those circumstances are very rare outside of the boundaries of live combat.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as we move into more digitally powered combat, I think that even changes the nature of combat and how we have to approach it, moving much more towards mission command. So,
and what's interesting, when you observe craftspeople, not when you get out of the realm of software, and when you observe craftspeople, we have some hardscaping project going on at our house. It involves a collection of things where there's a reasonably good design, but there's a fair amount of art in bringing this design to life. And there's this crew of stonemasons, and I've had the chance to observe them over the past 6-ish months, and it's really remarkable. They almost never just go do something on their own. They're always having these little conversations about, hey, are we addressing this piece the right way? How might we do a better job on manifesting the design of this wall? And it's actually natural. They're not working to a plan. They're not staging out, N days worth of work. They're figuring out what's the most important thing for us to do in the next 2 hours. But they're doing it constantly. And I can guarantee you they don't have any methodology. They've never heard of Marty Kagan. They don't know, they wouldn't understand anything that we're talking about, but they live it. And they're quite good at what they do. And they work largely unsupervised. And this is a non-trivial project. And I've seen this in lots of cases.
Yeah. I want to look at maybe a different side of the fiat. When you talk about Dana, one thing you have, as you said, it can be hard to spot sometimes, especially as an outsider. Everybody inside the organization knows who it is, but it can be hard to spot, especially leadership has a hard time spotting it. But they often out themselves post fact. So like I will see often leaders leave. In fact, recently, character in the DoD, if they had only done what I said, all of these things would have been successful. And this really bad thing that happened over here wouldn't have happened if they had just listened to me. And it's interesting because these people are often, as you said, they're actually product minded. They're saying a lot of the same things that we're saying, but they don't actually have the leadership ability to grant people autonomy and provide vision and direction. They still are leaderships by fiat.
Yeah,
they happen to be a little bit more technically informed than others, but
it
usually doesn't get much farther than the old legacy budget pageant process. So have you seen much of that?
Yeah, because leadership by fiat is also in some ways at its core. And again, when I say by fiat, I mean leaders who basically say, do this way. It's at its core also somewhat disrespectful of human capability. It is making some presumption that you as an individual do have some kind of superior knowledge and superior foresight. And that's just provably wrong. But unfortunately, still, there's still an awful lot about that. We haven't talked about Chris. Chris is the offsetting character to Dana. Chris is often quite skilled. Chris, though, approaches most problems by saying, I'm not sure what we should do here. How can we learn a little bit more about, I've seen things that look like this before, but this is this thing in this time. And Chris cultivates a beginner's mind, even though Chris has expertise. Dana cultivates an expert's mind, even though Dana may have as much or less or more, expertise than Chris. There's a difference between having expertise and acting on your expertise. And so the Chris character, the one who actually believes that most of the rest of the people around here can help too, that the standard deviation of IQ points is actually not that high. that the standard deviation of commitment to the cause is actually not that high. As a leader, I'm not somehow exponentially more deeply invested in doing a good job than thousands of people around me. And Chris tends to approach things by saying, yeah, I might have been doing this for 30 years. So that gives me a great foundation from which to examine current circumstances anew.
Yeah, in light of Southwest, this is very obvious too, because everybody is jumping out of the woodwork to opine. If only they had done this, including probably some people at Southwest.
Yeah.
And I noticed your reaction was probably more aligned to what you just said with Chris. But you said something to the effect of, everybody was saying in this thread I saw, oh, they should do this X, Y, and Z with technology.
Oh boy, yeah.
And you said, look, the tech is the reflection of the culture and the politics. Changing the software first requires addressing those in a meaningful way. And you had an interesting definition of politics too that I think is worth visiting. But what's the process there? How do you change the tech at South?
Yeah, and Brian, thanks for giving me an opportunity to be a little bit more rich and deep on this topic, because I think it's an important one. It's a difficult thing to get across in the sound bites that are a LinkedIn post. And I was also thankful that that Kyle Arate did poke me and say, hey, those are fancy words, because I don't think they are fancy words. The fact that they might be fancy words is another underlying problem. So I'll get to what I mean by politics, but just for folks who haven't read it, as everyone saw, particularly for those of us who hang around with technology people, Southwest has this big operations implosion, and then the chorus. This is all like a Greek drama, right? Like the chorus, who's easily swayed by the most immediate circumstances, very rarely is in touch with the bigger picture. The chorus chimes in and says, yeah, they really need to deal with their technical debt. They've underinvested in new technology. And my reaction was not at all just about Southwest. I've seen these circumstances hundreds of times. And the current tech, debt and all, is the result not of technology. It is the result of what I label as politics and culture. And what I mean by politics is to sort of go way back to Aristotle, and one of Aristotle's books that's still read and still important and still with us is The Politics. And that's from the Greek polis, which is about how we are with each other, how we live together as a society. And to the extent that every enterprise is a little mini society and has some kind of societal norms and some kind of social compact by which people tacitly or not kind of agree to exist together. Politics is that collection of the how do you do that? How does this enterprise, how does this polis, how does this polity do that? And there are a lot of corporate enterprises where the politics, the organization of the little mini society, is very power centric, and so it is a power-based hierarchy. And when there is a power-based hierarchy and you need a change, you need to change the power. Now, sometimes that can be a correctly placed leader with some better insights, but it's very, very challenging to get the results of collaborative politics when the organization's politics are power politics. And in circumstances where I've seen a meaningful disconnect between the way a critical piece of technology works and the way that the people who use it actually need it to work, that's usually the product of the politics of the organization aren't building things for the people who actually use them. They're building them for the people who have power at corporate. Southwest is not alone in that it's very, very difficult to solve these problems, right? Again, a lot of sympathy for the folks at Southwest, and actually not very much knowledge. I'm going only on what's been what's been publicly reported. But one of the things that's been publicly reported is the thing that is implicated here is this system, which evidently is a commercial software package, but sort of super heavily customized for scheduling and revising the schedule of people to match flights and planes. And that I would be shocked. I mean, I'd bet a large amount of money that if we did a little anthropological expedition with a couple of unbiased witnesses and just went and spent a couple weeks just living with pilots and crew and ground crew and all of the other people who have to be scheduled, I would be shocked if a single person said, yeah, I find this current system super helpful to doing my job. I actually wouldn't be shocked if we didn't find dozens, if not hundreds, of workarounds. And then this kind of enmeshed thing. And when the real system breaks, the workarounds break too. But the workarounds are largely unknown. So then you get this whole mess. And so to put a bow on that, I think the message is the chorus will immediately, and those who kind of study Greek plays, the chorus immediately has a reaction. The chorus always has a reaction. The chorus's reaction is usually not the voice you actually want to listen to, but there might be some kernel of truth in there. So the chorus erupts and says, someone should go in and, build a new system. Well, if a new system is going to get built in the current power structure, it's just it's very, very long odds that it solves any of the problems that the people using the system. I would encourage anyone in the situation to go, put together the 2Jeep team. It wouldn't take long for a skilled observer to go to 5 or 6 meetings at Southwest and figure out the 8 or 10 people who actually have really credible knowledge about this business problem.
Right.
And tell everyone else to just leave them alone and stop talking about this part of the business problem until they've had a chance to go out and build an experimental replacement hand in hand with some flight crews that actually know what does or doesn't work on a day in and day out basis. And hey, for all I know, maybe they're doing this, and my hat's off to them. There are some videos out there about their safe implementation, so I find it unlikely that team is being allowed to do that.
Yeah, I want to transition to talk about one way we can create that space related to the budget pageant, and then I want to give folks time to ask questions. But one quick story, and I think I shared this with you as we were, pre-discussion. I know a pilot at another airline that has this same problem. They have the exact same system, and he tried to get the enterprise to build a solution. When they didn't, he actually built an iOS and Android app and started selling it to other pilots and crew. And the airline came and shut that down. And and threatened legal action against him.
Oh boy!
So that's where you get into those turf wars. And I see this in the DoD all the time because we have long running projects, usually a decade, and every single one is mostly a dumpster fire. And so then we start a new project to replace the old one, and everybody's just like, oh, well, we're just going to replace the technology and it's going to solve all these problems. But they build it in the same power structure.
Yep.
And even a really simple example, like the Air Force promotion review system, promotion reports. You can read horror stories about that on Reddit, and they've even bled into LinkedIn, which is always a sign of just
that they boiled over. Yeah.
Like what was a PDF, primarily a PDF process, a lot of SharePoint involved, to just automating a pretty simple workflow to, I say that loosely, to create a promotion report for somebody. And so you see this all the time. It's the power structure is the problem, by and large, not the technology or even the people creating it. Segue into the creating that space for that 2Jeep team. That's going to be my new thing now, 2Jeep team. I love it. We don't have a lot of time to dive deep into the budget pageant, but one thing that I've learned from you and somebody that you've spent a lot of time with, Siobhan McFeeney, is this concept of growth boards. I'm going to give you a pass here on government budgets, but for my government listeners, I'll use a DoD example that I think probably applies to federal, but each federal agency has different budgeting. You need to structure your budget in a way that at a portfolio level, a portfolio being a portfolio of several products, could be 3, it could be 10, that you have flexibility to move your money around. So if you're in the DoD, I would tell you, look at aligning your BPACs and your PEs in such a way that you can freely move money at a project level without getting higher level approval. And there's ways to do that. And I'm happy to discuss that with anybody if they're interested. But let's just say you have that flexibility to move money around in a portfolio, Paul. Talk to me about growth boards and how you've seen them work, and maybe not work as well.
Yeah. One of the reasons that you have to do that, and Siobhan and I have collaborated on this several times, is you generally don't get the chance to do what I've done in 2 instances, which is to shed a lot of resources. So you usually still have more demand than capability, and in many cases, it becomes quite difficult to discern what is the most valuable thing to work on. So I think the answer to that is just to constantly revisit, because you learn a little bit more every week or every month. So a growth board is a mechanism for formalizing that frequent revisiting. And so you pick a period. So let's say monthly. It's probably in many organizations, you shouldn't do this more than like every other month. And you pick a adjacent collection of products that you can put a sensible label on. And if you zoom too far out, the meetings are unmanageable. If you zoom too far in, you can't make trade-offs. So that's a little bit of an art. You'll know you have it right when most of the regular attendees of the growth board still seem to be engaged. When there's very low engagement, you've got too little in play, and a lot of people just hanging around. And when everybody is like constantly battling, the scope's too small. What's important here is this is a recognition. This is a CRISP behavior, and the CRISP behavior is, we laid out a product map. We assigned some resources to it, but that doesn't mean we were right. We did that based on what we knew at the time. Facts and circumstances are going to change because the world around us keeps throwing new punches at us. And we have to demonstrate that the technology organization also operates with the same kind of fast feedback loops on resource allocation. And it gives you good calibration too, if you can independently then keep track of how are various stakeholders behaving in these boards. Are they, this is the mechanism that in the project world, you can feign ignorance of, I got a project approved for this. I might actually know that it's causing problems for 20 other parts of the company, but in the project world, I don't have to know. I'm going to leave that to the architecture review board to go beat people up about. In the product world, these growth boards help with this ongoing process of educating the organization about the consequences of fragmented systems. And that by doing them, you enlist more people in the cause of actually getting to harmonious products.
I love it. That was a great overview. There's way more we could go into on growth boards. It sounds easy, but I tell you, I have experience implementing them in several orgs, and it is very difficult. And it takes a lot of practice. I would say follow up with either of us if you're in the audience and you have questions about it. But the number one thing I would say, just like OKRs, your first round is going to suck, and your second round is going to suck a little less, and you just have to continue to iterate and stick with it and get used to the rituals and the discipline behind it.
Hey, Brian, I see a couple interesting questions here. You want to tackle them?
I do, yeah. So this first one, we got to be a little careful here because there's a little politics in this one. But the question is, did Twitter need cleaning up, hence the firings? If we put aside some of the political dialogue from that, and we just analyze, I would say most of the big tech companies, particularly the social media companies, do you think they have too high of headcount? Do you think that?
Well, I mean, Brian, we are seeing across the board massive layoffs in the parts of the tech economy that have had manic growth
Yep.
over the past 10-ish years. And almost everyone, almost every leader of every one of those enterprises that is cutting heads is saying, we got it wrong. We grew our headcount faster than our business justified. So, I mean, no one is using the very plain language that said, we hired too many people. But, this matches my hypothesis of fundamental organizational problems anyway, that most organizations have too many people. It's still kind of managerial currency, how many people you got to hire. So the question about Twitter, I don't know that they in any unique way had a different, like, too many people problem. And, I would argue, I emphasize being very humane about these things. It didn't look very humane. Sorry about that. The question refers to a cleaning up. I don't know that the headcount change and I don't know what the questioner means by cleaning up. So we have to explore that some more.
Yeah, I think maybe when we were talking about getting off the bus, you had used that phrase, cleaning up. So I'm assuming it's related to that. I think another question from the audience: how often are product teams or the people doing the work asked what is needed to achieve business outcomes versus management assuming the solution, like we talked about?
It's just such a wonderful question, because even the phrasing of the question indicates a paradigm, right? That someone is asking that question, right? And so I advocated for give a 2Jeep team an economic target and then the freedom to go achieve that economic target. In that model, they're the only ones who will ask themselves, what do we need? The question, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions at the questioner at all. I think this is actually the dominant mindset, that the team is going to be told in some way or another what to do. And an improvement in that might be, if you're going to tell them what to do you at least ask them? And I would say, well, that would be an improvement. I mean, if you are still essentially going to give teams instructions, asking them is a good idea. I think not giving them instructions and giving them goals. Folks in the military know, right? There are like two schools of commander's intent, right? There's the commander's intent that is simply goal and end state. And then there's the commander's intent that's goal, end state, and how I want you to do it. And I think the data is that the folks who do that second version of the commander's intent don't go very far. So I do think that you have to believe that you have competent people, and then you have to acknowledge, and this is a very mindset, that if you have competent people and you assign them to something, it's not going to be very long before they know more about that something than anyone else. And at that point, it's really arrogant to give them advice about tackling the something.
Yeah, and if you have more, anybody else has questions, please put them in the chat. One interesting variation of what you just said that happens in the enterprise a lot is, we want to take small initiatives, like maybe this team over here built a really great cloud platform for their apps. And the enterprise is like, hey, I want to build an enterprise cloud like that. But then they don't ask that team.
Yeah.
They just stand up a new team, usually with somebody important and all the people that he thinks are or she thinks are important. And then they go try to build that thing. Is that something like how do you guard against that?
Yeah, there's another element of kind of the corporate creature DNA that wants to be in rollout mode. So there's this like deep desire to identify something that we can roll out and then roll it out. And so, yeah, this team built this neat little thing. Can we roll that out to everybody? And what I try to encourage people is, first of all, to recognize that that's a huge warning sign. Wanting to roll something out is fiat behavior. It is inflicting things on people. And when you can develop a lot more organizational empathy for the front line, a lot more people learn that the front lines in most organizations believe that largely things have been inflicted on them, that they have not actually been allowed to participate in solving their own problems. And when you start allowing them to be in the driver's seat, you get all kinds of beneficial results. And so the question that you ask is also the premature solutioning. So the first thing to get on everyone's minds is, have we really engaged the people who we're going to roll this out to ask them if this is really what they need, and to understand how we might really learn that versus inflicting on them? And it's a good question to say, hey, are we at risk of just inflicting this on people? Have we actually figured out if they really want it? That is a very human-centered and a question that's difficult to dodge. The related question is, well, what problem are we solving here? A rollout is generally not problem-oriented; it's solution-oriented.
Yes.
I have this widget and I want it everywhere. And it is possible that you could step back and say, what problem are we solving? And someone can articulate a problem that is in fact solved by rolling this thing out. But it's much better to have that answer before doing the rollout.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do one more question. I want to just give a shout out too. We've had a really active audience here, like Lee Ladke, Kelso, Edward Clark, Rick Green, Chris DeJong, Scott Nasello, Andrew Gasson. So really active in there. Appreciate it. The last question, I'll go with Kelso's here, is one that I actually wanted to ask, so I'm glad that he brought it up. And I've asked you about this before. Assuming that you're lower level in the organization, so you've been the CTO, but you've also been below, kind of mentoring up. How do you get your managers to allow teams, or how do you get them to make that shift to allowing more autonomy?
I don't have a pervasive answer to this question. Some of it is just cultivating the courage to believe in your team. The last part of this question is about teams that needed to have their autonomy reined in. That's actually a good guardrail. It's good to bump into that guardrail. And if you're bumping into that guardrail, you're doing a lot of things right. So strive. When Arthur Blank wrote about this in the book that he and Bernie wrote about the founding of Home Depot. Arthur's approach, and Arthur and Bernie were the co-founders of Home Depot. Arthur was the second CEO, was the CEO during the big expansion era, and had these regional presidents. And he would say to the regional presidents, I can't tell you what the boundaries are. I'm going to practice the invisible fence school of dog management, and when you come near or go over the invisible fence, I'm going to give you a shock. And it actually worked. I mean, he gave 7 regional presidents enormous autonomy, and Home Depot blanketed the country. In the most efficient way? No. In the fastest way? Probably. And with great long-term effect. And so I think you should strive as a leader to more frequently encounter the problem of, my teams have too much agency. How do you do that? Sometimes if you're in the middle of the organization, and I have a longer story on this, Brian, so I'm happy to tell it at another time, but I realized that early in my career, I was 3 or 4 levels away from the CIO of Schwab at the time. We had a really big problem to solve. And these big problems, as we talked about, they have this static cling. And so there were like hundreds of people involved, yet there was actually no hope of solving this critical problem. And having all those 100 people participate, it was just impossible. And the role I played was simply to speak that truth to the 2 leaders who were most implicated in making this right. One technology leader and the leader of the mutual funds operation. And I had my success in that instance was getting them to recognize that their success was impaired by having all these people, and that their most important job was to, if there were 100 people, was to get 94 of them to go away and never bother the team again.
I love that. I think that ends us kind of right back where we started as a good stopping point. I think if you guys want to throw up that Chiron for Paul, but if you want to follow Paul again, you can reach him at Paul Gaffney, Paul at gaffney.io, or on Twitter and LinkedIn there. Paul, any closing thoughts from you?
No, Brian, thank you for inviting me into the world of government and defense. I've learned a lot from you and from the audience that there's just, as you know, not a tremendous amount of overlap between the people in your world and in the world I've been in, but there's an enormous overlap of the problems, and there's an enormous overlap of the successful ways out. So thanks for giving me an opportunity. We spent a little bit of time in problem space. I hope we also spent some useful time in solution space, and folks who want to explore solutions more, you know where to reach me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us again. Audience, thank you. Please follow Paul, and also follow along for Prodacity updates over at our website. And I'd love to see everyone out at Prodacity 2023. Thank you.